Back again, and welcome back to another video within this PHP framework series. And in this video, we're going to be building out our data table component. Now, this component has got quite a few moving parts, so we're going to be breaking it down into a couple of videos, just so you guys, or just so I can make sure you guys got the complete or the full grasp of what I'm trying to implement. Just a simple component in all reality. It's got some moving parts, and I want to break it down so you guys got a very good understanding of what I'm essentially trying to do, which is to wrap a class around an HTML table containing data that's coming from our database. So without further ado, we're going to jump straight into it. I'm going to create this first video, which is going to be creating some data table columns, and we're going to be implementing those interface and that data column directory in our app directory. So let's do that, get started. And first thing we're going to do is I'm going to create a table, or create a directory in my Magma core directory, because this is going to be a core component. So it's going to be data table, and the first classes that I want to create is my data table column interface and a abstract class. So I'm going to create those and explain to you what they're doing. So it's going to be data table column interface .php. Let's just build that out. Declare strict types equal 1. Then we're going to do namespace Magma data table, and it's an interface. It's called data table column interface, and this actual interface only going to be exposing one single method for the time being. So it's going to be a public function columns, and it's going to be returning an array, or I want it to return an array. So the second class is going to be an abstract class. So it's be a new abstract data table column .php. So let's build that out. Declare strict types equal 1, namespace, and it's going to be Magma data table, and it's going to be an abstract class. So we'll start off with the abstract keyword, then class and abstract data table column, and that's going to implement that interface, data table column interface, just like that. And again, let's just bring this in. We don't have to, but I want to keep it so it's compatible whatever environment that we're using this framework in. So it's going to be use Magma data table, and it's that data table column interface. Right? So I want to be able to create some column classes within my application. I will need to extend this abstract data table column. I will need to implement that columns interface. So I'm going to force all classes that extend this abstract data column class to implement that columns method. I'm going to say abstract public function, and it's going to be that columns, and that's just going to return an array, just like that. So the idea behind the columns class is that in my application, I want to be able to define a list of columns that I want to loop over to build that data table. And these, let's just build it out, and you will see exactly what I'm saying. So I'm going to simulate what I want these columns to look like. So if I go back up into my application, let's create a new directory, call it DataColumns. Right? Within this, we're going to be sticking with the user theme. I'm going to create user columns .php. Let's just build that out so you've got a visual idea of what I'm trying to implement. It's be PHP declare strict types equal 1 namespace within that app directory. We're now within that data columns directory, right? It's called data columns, yep. And its class is going to be user columns, and we're going to be extending that abstract data column or data table column. So it's going to be abstract and data table columns, just like that, and it brought it in for us as well. And if I put my mouse right here, you will see what it's saying. It says we need to implement the columns method. So all of our columns class within this data columns has to implement that method. So we're going to say public function columns. That's going to return an array, and it's got a body. So what are we trying to implement? I'm trying to return a list of array, and within each of those arrays is going to be a map to a column in my data table, in my database table. So for instance, we've got a user table within our database. Within that table, we've got a lot of different columns, right? We might have first name, last name, email, address, etc., etc. So I want to map each of those, and what that allows us to do is to manipulate that data within that data table however we want to do it. So I'm going to say return an array, and within this return array, I'm going to return an array of columns within that database table. So I'm going to say array, and I'm going to define some keys and set some value. So we're going to say db row, and that's going to be the column name in that database table, and the first row is going to be ID, right? Now I'm going to also set a next one called DT row, and on this we can actually do something different in the table itself. We can make this into a checkbox, or we could just say ID in capital, right? The next one is going to be the class, and this is going to be what we apply to our table column or our table row, right? And it's just going to be a string. The next one is going to be show columns or show column. To set that to true, and I want to be able to disable a column or show a column based on how we want that to look, right? Next one is going to be sortable. So we can make whatever column in our data table sortable or not. And that's going to default to false for this one. And the last one is going to be formatter. And this is going to return, this is like a closure. So we got a function that's got some arguments, and that's going to take in the data, and we can manipulate that data however we want. We could display it however we want. We could change it. We could do whatever we want with this formatter option. And it will look something like this. It'll be function, and it's going to be row, which is going to be the database row that contains all the data for this particular row, right? And we could return something like row ID or row last name, and we could modify that data how we want, or we could just put empty string to return the original data as it is, right? So that's pretty much the idea. And I want to map I want to create an array for each of the columns in my database table. So I'm going to copy this, put a comma, paste that in, and I'm going to change that to first name, because I know the fields that I've got in the database table that we're working with at the moment. We got ID, first name, could say first name or we could just say name, whatever we want is what's going to show in our data table. Put a comma, let's copy that one with the comma. And this is going to be last name. Last name, email, email address. Let's change that one to email address. And we've got status. Change that to status. We've got created at. This is the date time field. It's called created at. We could say published. We got modified at. Say modified. And we've got one that says gravatar. We could just say thumb, our thumbnail, whatever. And got a next one called IP, and that's the IP address. We could say IP address. And we've got a next one, and this is going to be our action. So if you notice in some data table, we got the option within each row to delete or edit. So because that's not a field within our database, this is a custom field that a custom row we're adding on. We're going to leave the DB row empty, and I'm going to say action within this, and within this actual array, we're going to be using the formatter to actually display those buttons that we need to, or those action buttons that's going to delete or edit a row, right? So we've mapped this entire array to our users database table, and it contains all the columns within that table, so we can display them within our data table and manipulate it however we want, right? So this is how we're going to be defining any columns that's going to need a data table. We're going to define arrays like this and change it according to the table that we're trying to map to. So let's close that out temporarily, and we'll finish with this abstract class for now, and we'll finish with that interface for now. So that part of the data table is finished for the time being. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to create the classes for our data table. So back into our Magma core directory, in our data table directory, I'm going to create a couple of classes. The first is going to be a data table interface.php. Then we've got a data table.php, right? And I've also got an abstract data table.php class. So let's create these interface methods first, so you got an idea of what we're working with. It's going to be PHP declare strict types equal 1 namespace magma data table. It's going to be an interface data table interface, and I've got 3 methods that I want to work with initially, and that's what we're going to be putting in for the time being. And the first is going to be public function create, and this method takes in 3 arguments, and the first is a string, which is going to be the data column string, right? So when I say data column string, we're going to be passing in like a namespace reference to this actual class right here. We're going to instantiate that class within this create method. So that's the first argument. The second argument is going to be an array, and we actually need the data for each entity or for each model. So we're going to pass a repository method in, which is going to give us back the data that we need plus some additional goodies that we're going to need for our table. So it's going to be data repository. And to set that to an empty array for now. And the third and last argument is also an array, and I'm going to be calling this sort controller. And within our controller files, if we're going to our controller files, within the index method, because this is the method, or this is the action route that's going to be displaying all of our tables, and we can define additional arguments, like for example, we can define how much records we want to show per table, right? So we're going to set that array within this sort controller argument, and we're going to pass that in. So, and this is going to be self, because it's going to be a chainable method, and we're going to be chaining on that second argument, which is going to be our table. So I'm going to set this to an empty array before we leave it. And the next method is going to be that table method that we're going to chain onto that create method, and this is going to generate or build out that HTML table dynamically, right? And that's going to be a string or a null, right? It's got no arguments in. It's just going to take the data that's available within the data table class and build out that table. And the third and last method is going to be the pagination, and that's going to allow us to scroll through the data within our table, because if you've got 1,000 records in your database, you don't want to be displaying all of that in one table. You want to split it down, break it down, and that's what the pagination does. It allows us to break our table down so we can scroll through them at however we want. And that's also going to be string or null. Right? So that's the method for our data table interface. Let's sort of like go in and start implementing these methods. But I actually want to implement that interface within this abstract data table class. To say PHP declare strict types equal 1 to be namespace, to be magma data table, and this is an abstract class, so we're going to go with the abstract keyword. Abstract class. I'm going to say abstract data table, and we're going to be implementing that interface, which is that data table interface, like that. Right? So let's just bring this in again. Magma data table, and we need that interface. Right? So I'm going to create a constructor method within this abstract class. Public function construct. And it's going to take in one argument that's going to be passed into our data table, and we're going to create a parent construct and pass those values in. So what we're expecting right here is an array of attributes. So let's leave it like that. Yep. And in our data table, we're going to build this out. The PHP declare strict types equal 1 namespace, and it's going to be magma data table, just like that. Class data table, and we're going to extend that abstract data table class, which already implements that interface. So it's going to prompt us to implement those interface. Right, so if I put my mouse right here, you will see what it's saying. Data table does not implement methods create, table, and pagination, which is what we want. We want to be implementing those within this particular class. But we're going to also create a constructor method. It'll be public function constructor, and we're going to pass in that same argument as we did in the abstract class, and then pass it down to this abstract class. So it's going to be array attributes, right? Then I'm going to say parent : construct, and we're going to pass those attributes in, just like that. Because remember, we cannot instantiate abstracts class. We can instantiate this one, and we can pass the value in and then pass it back down to the parent of the abstract class, abstract data table class, right? So I'm going to list those methods out. Let's copy them from our interface. Just put our body on them. So we know what we need to be implementing. Body. Right, so we're no longer getting that error because we now got a reference to all of the method that we're meant to be implementing.